So I'm sure there's lots of people who want to come in with questions and comments. I'm going to open it up to the wider debate now. We'll probably take a few at a time. There's a microphone around. I'd be grateful if people could say who they are before they start. And please bear in mind, it's all being recorded and will be put up on the website later this week. Okay, first one over there.
Hi, Felix Baden-Powell from the LSE. I have a question for Milford. Thank you very much for the talk, first of all. I was wondering, how did you select the groups that you investigated, the microfinance groups? And if it wasn't a random sample, how can you be confident that contextual factors such as little financial literacy or low levels of market access are not driving the negative results you found? Thank you.
Hi, John Frew. Don't work in development, so I'm sorry if this is a naive question, but for you as well, Milford. There are a couple of points in what you said where some of the things seemed, at least on the surface, to be slightly in tension. I was wondering if you could elaborate. One is that we've got this full cost recovery model, but we're also wasting a lot of money. And those don't seem obviously to go together. The other is that you've got too much capital, too much microfinance available, but it's also at really high interest rates. It's too expensive. And normally you'd only expect one or other of those things rather than both. And I can see how you could start to square the circle with unscrupulous micro-profiteers skimming off large rents from defenceless and exploited, ill-informed poor people, but is there something more to it than that?
I think the lady with the red t-shirt.
Hi, my name's Ruth Campston. My question is to Milford. It's when you were writing your book, did you also look at some of the other finance schemes that the microfinance institutes offer, such as microinsurance, and what's your conclusions about their usefulness as well?
Okay, should we take those three?
Okay. I didn't select groups to analyse, if you're meaning in the sort of econometric or statistical sense. What I did do is that, and it goes back to something that came up just there about when I was speaking in Bosnia or working in Bosnia in the mid-1990s and arguing against microfinance, the standard argument, the standard response to me was always, well, hang on a second, we don't have a critical mass yet in Bosnia. When you see it, then you'll start to see the real impact. The moment we're just building it up. So what I decided for the book was to select those regions, localities, countries which have got sufficient microfinance, so that you can, that argument about not being a critical mass doesn't actually apply. So if we start to look at Bangladesh, well, everybody's got an access to a microfinance, to a microcredit, the same in Bolivia, Bosnia, pretty much everywhere else. So I stuck to those examples where microfinance has reached critical mass, so the argument that there isn't enough doesn't actually come into play. So that was just really the selection of those. In terms of the full cost recovery and there being a disjunction between, well, wasting money, well, full cost recovery was about making the poor pay for the full cost of the services that they access, whether it was education, health, business development services, or microfinance. And in a sense, you are saving money in the sense that they are actually having to cough up the cash, and you can actually run a service which pays for itself. But on the other side, it is actually a major waste of money if it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. I mean, if you're, the microfinance institution can actually survive without the aid of international donors or subsidized capital, but if it doesn't actually develop the local economy as it's supposed to do, then what's the point? So in that sense, it is a huge waste of money if it doesn't actually do what it's supposed to do. So merely having something that survives, I mean, tobacco companies survive on selling their goods to a market, but that doesn't actually mean to say that they're actually producing something that's of benefit. So the survivability of the institution and the survivability of the local economy are two separate issues. I missed the other point you said, but then, yeah, the issue of looking at different types of schemes that have now emerged over the last 20 years, microinsurance, consumer lending, all those sorts of things. Sure, you could start to have a look at those other financial programs that have been bolted onto the original Grameen Bank model. But part of the reason they were bolted onto the original Grameen Bank model was because the original Grameen Bank model was failing. So I've heard this from many people that, well, we have to put a savings component in. Do you think that works? Because we know the original Grameen Bank model doesn't actually work, component doesn't work. But we'll put in some savings and we'll put in some microinsurance. Then we'll have some positive impact. And so why should we be looking at different types of financial institutions or interventions that come on later? That wasn't the point of the book. The point of the book was to look at the original income generating via microcredit idea that was the Grameen Bank idea, and then take it from there. All sorts of other things have come on in the meantime, like savings, microinsurance, which are positive, but they're not really part of what I was looking at.
Just to respond to that question, I don't know whether Milford will necessarily agree with it, but the one reason why you are seeing those contradictory things is, let's face it, poor people are high risk. There's no way getting around it, and this is why they don't have financial access, because the famous dictum among British bankers is never lend money to anyone who needs it. Poor people have low skills. They tend to have bad health. They tend to work in dangerous jobs, so they can get injured more easily, and so on and so on. So, if you leave it to the market, yes, the market will have to charge them 40-50%, which, however, is not compatible with growing sustainable business. So I think that the only way is that there has to be some element of subsidization. Might be small, might be large, might be for a short period, long period. But I think that unless you accept that, that there are good reasons why market charge them high rates. It's not simply what you call the microfinance profiteers. Although there is that SKS or Compratamos, that there are certainly that. It's that basically because these people are high risk cases. I don't know whether Milford will agree with that.
You've got a forest of hands over there, so I suspect probably plenty of people want to come back on that particular point. So.
Okay. At the back.
Thanks. Claire Melamed from the ODI. Milford, you've given a sort of long list of reasons why particular microcredit projects might fail, to do with high interest rates, to do with loans being too small for people to be able to do anything with them, or in some cases too big and producing a sort of fallacy of composition and lack of domestic demand, a whole range of, and to do with the external environment, government policies and so on. I just wonder whether it's possible to rank any of those problems and whether there's any indication in the research you've done of what are the really key problems which might provide some sort of guide in terms of moving forward and trying to provide some different form of credit to poor people, and even other forms, other ways of getting money to poor people through cash transfers or whatever, whether there's any kind of general principles to be drawn out of the long list that you've produced.
Okay, lady at the front in red, please.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation where you had a lot of detail and had to go through very quickly. I think what we have here is, in a sense, a selection of what is bad about microfinance. And it's a very healthy alternative to what we've heard in the past about what is so good or hoped for microfinance. And it reminds me a bit about the reasons of why we heard about the US and the UK going into the war in Iraq. They looked at the data and, okay, well, this is what they felt, and so they went in. And I get the sense that we all tend maybe to see what is the available data, and then we draw the conclusions that we have already we want to make from them. And so at the end, when you say, oh, you've missed out these 3 interesting examples of what is bad about microcredit, there are also some interesting examples about developments, I think, within the microcredit field, which really, I think, are reflecting on these areas that you mentioned. And I would like to mention the role of the Social Performance Task Force, which has started over the last few years. It would be good to see that in your book too, to really try and address some of these issues that are there, what the effect of commercialization, the hype around microfinance, what Mohammed Yunus said right at the start has really maybe diverted people from what can be really effective about microfinance services for different types of poor people in different types of markets. And I think the issues you raise about the missing middle, small and medium enterprises, agriculture, yes, microfinance isn't trying to address those. Maybe the banks, I think as one of the speakers said, they can downscale to that, and that is an area. I don't think, I would just like to make the point that the criticisms you're making are ones that really are very relevant, but that the industry is trying to address them.
Gentlemen. Gentleman with white hair.
The hand disappeared.
I can't see whose hand it is.
Stick your hand.
Okay.
The lady is Francis Sinner from MCRIL, I should say. My name is Malcolm Harper, also kind of from MCRIL. It's called Why Doesn't Microfinance Work? Why isn't it called Why Doesn't Tesco Work? Or that would be ridiculous. We've now, or the donors and all, have created an industry, microfinance. Doesn't need donors anymore. It's making a lot of money. It's like Tesco's. Nobody expects Tesco's, or Walmart, whatever they're called, just to do good things. Lots and lots of poor people buy stuff from them, lower prices than anywhere else, or more convenient or whatever. And they do bad things too. And we complain about the bad things, we applaud them for the good things. But I think microfinance has rather gone beyond the stage when it's a development tool that we can agonize about in the ODI. It's a business. Nothing we say or do here is going to make any difference to it. It's a business, it's doing its thing, some good things, some bad things. So we can look back perhaps and say, ooh, we shouldn't have, I wouldn't have done it at all, but it's done, it's gone. And it's gone and become a real big business, just like Tesco's, and we don't have sessions on why doesn't Tesco's work.
I think one more. I think there's a gentleman here. Just here, on the back, next to you.
Alan Gilbert, UCL. One comment and then a couple of little questions. Some years ago, I was interviewing people in Washington in USAID and the Inter-American Development Bank. I remember talking about Inandra de Soto at USAID, and you mentioned him, Milford. And one guy said, we are hugely embarrassed about Inandra de Soto. We should never have lent him any money. Indeed, this person claimed to have cut him off from USAID funding. But he told the story of how Inandra de Soto first arrived at USAID. Instead of most people arriving cap in hand, saying, can we have your help? Can we have your money? I've got this great idea. He swept in with great high-level political support, and everybody was kowtowing to Inandra de Soto. Now, I suspect microfinance is sort of similar. If you have a charismatic leader who sweeps into your institution, which has broadly failed to resolve poverty over many generations, and offers you the Holy Grail, you grab it. And you do not check the information. And indeed, the information is fudged in the case of Inandra de Soto. So I think this is the optimism of aid institutions constantly looking for something new because everything else has failed. And I think that's the simple explanation. Now, my two questions are, first, what does the subprime issue in the United States and the credit card debacle in this country tell us about what ordinary people understand about finance, like compound interest rates? doesn't it suggest they do not understand? And even though I'm inclined to believe that the banks and even some microfinance institutions are rotters, part of the problem is that these people are borrowing without a proper awareness of what's going on. Of course, the defense of that is that if microfinance is lending at 30 to 40%, usurers might be lending at 50 to 60%. So there might be some help from that. My other question is to Mark. The equivalent of Tesco in South Africa, or the Tescos in South Africa, are lending money on the basis of lending to their customers. And they lend small amounts, and of course the customers have got a credit rating with the supermarkets in South Africa. What's the experience of Finmar with these commercial schemes? Because that seems to be one way which combines real business, and presumably they don't make a loss, but I don't know much about it, and I'd like to know more.
Thank you. I think that's enough questions.
Okay, that's a good point that I didn't really try to raise in the book in terms of ranking the problems with microfinance. But I think one of the key problems then, if I was to pick one that was above everything else, I would say it would be the issue of the channeling of scarce resources, that's local savings, remittance income, into enterprises with no real long-term potential, and by definition not channeling it into other enterprises. You can, just two examples, I mentioned already this very interesting Inter-American Development Bank report looking at Latin America, and its fundamental conclusion was that Latin America has misallocated its resources. That's the fundamental reason. It's not because of foreign direct investment deficit or whatever. It was the misallocation of their own resources into enterprises that had no real potential to develop. So it's very powerful. So that they've and the two countries that they actually flag up as good examples, or the best examples of this misallocation, were Mexico and Bolivia, which of course are countries which have really bought into the microfinance paradigm. And the connection between them, although it's not examined in the book, is actually, I think if anybody did any econometric surveys, I'm sure they would find a connection between them. Another example of the same thing in terms of the misallocation of resources is going back to the issue of the comparison I made between Vietnam and Bangladesh. The Vietnam policymakers were intent on changing. They went to Grameen in the 1990s to look at the Grameen Bank model. They said, this is not developmental, we are not going to go down this way. And they decided to modify the Chinese model of rural and urban credit cooperatives. And they introduced a much more policy-driven, much more state involvement, and much more lower interest rates because of the horrible word subsidies. And we all know the result after 20 years. They were able to develop, channel the money into small enterprises, not so much micro enterprises, and into sustainable small farms, not into postage stamp garden plots. So those are two examples of the macro problem of misallocating the resources. So the economy still functions, but it functions at a much lower level than had you paid more attention to trying to allocate those resources into what you could see is the best way forward. So, but maybe that's something for future research, to start to look at what are the key, to make a list and to look at what, if we can come to number 1, number 2, number 3, we can actually design policies to address the most important ones first. What else? The argument of that there are all sorts of other financial measures that have emerged over the last couple of years was what we just said earlier. If I'm understanding what you said, these institutions and these interventions like microinsurance and savings, the microfinance industry reacted to the fact that the initial model wasn't actually working. So I think they were quite, and you find this in many paradigms that realise that there's nothing actually working at the core. They bolt on all sorts of other interesting things that might actually work, and then claim, well, we've got everything in this box. Quite a few of these things are, okay, the original one's not working, but all these other ones we bolted on over the last couple of years actually do work. But as I said earlier, that's not actually the point I'm looking at. I'm looking at the original model and saying whether that actually works or not. I mean, I'm quite happy to accept that savings, and there's a lot of activity going on with Oxfam, for example, on savings-driven development, and microinsurance is a big area. They might work. I haven't looked into them. But they're not part of the original idea. I agree with Malcolm when he talked about the microfinance is a business now, but I don't think we can just sort of accept that, well, they've taken the money and they've run and that's it. Because we still are looking to these institutions, even if we're not actually financing them as much as we used to do, but we're still looking to those institutions to resolve poverty on behalf of society. And if they aren't actually resolving poverty on behalf of the society, very often they block institutions that could be resolving poverty on behalf of society. So there is a space that they are occupying that other, perhaps better institutions could fill, but can't fill it because microfinance is in there. We've got the park to ourselves and we're not going to let you on. Even though you say we're not doing as good as we could be doing, we might accept that criticism, but we're not letting anybody else onto the park. And you see that in many countries. They are a powerful lobby, and alternatives get very short shrift. And I think that's actually very dangerous for development if you don't have alternatives that you can slot in when something clearly doesn't actually work. Going back to the original political issue, I mean, the Holy Grail, yes, I mean, when microfinance came along, it looked as though they had a feel-good response to poverty after many years of failure with structural adjustment programs. Here, this sexy thing called microfinance came along with an iconic pioneer, and it looked as though it worked. So let's not go into it too much. Let's just put it forward. But I would also add in that the ideological framework was there as well. I mean, self-help was something the World Bank was pushing in the 1980s. Individual entrepreneurship, don't look to the state, don't look to collective capabilities. All these things touched a nerve within the World Bank, within USAID. So when somebody come along, we said, well, we're not asking the poor, we're actually going to take this off the agenda for the poor. We're just going to give them microfinance. What do you think? Well, it's a slam dunk. I mean, of course they're going to accept it. So I think there's the idea, there's the feel-good idea, but also the ideological baggage, I think, is important. The last question on the subprime thing, I think microfinance is in a subprime crisis at the moment. I think there are many countries which are on the precipice, and we're seeing reports all the time that the rate of indebtedness is increasing in Bangladesh and in southern India and Bolivia. It's come back on the scene. So it looks as though there is a subprime style debacle coming up. I actually mentioned this at a previous talk that I gave, and the argument that I got back was, when is it going to happen? And when I said, well, I don't know, well, then maybe it isn't going to happen. I don't agree with that. The fact that I don't exactly know when we're going to jump off the cliff doesn't mean to say we're not going to jump off the cliff. So I think that something is about to happen. Clearly, the level of indebtedness in all these countries cannot go on ad infinitum. In countries that I work in, like Bosnia, well, there basically has been a meltdown, and there's been a huge default rate. Guarantors are coughing up. The microfinance institutions are in some disarray. And you've got to add that to the fact that they haven't actually done what they were set out to do in the first place. So you have very little development, and then you have a microfinance oversupply crisis at the end. And that seems to be the model that is emerging in all the countries. So no perceptible poverty reduction or development, and then an eventual oversupply crisis. So I think I touched upon responses.
Mark, did you want to respond?
Can I just clarify the last question about the Tesco? I think I got lost in the metaphors here, but unless you were...
That wasn't for me.
Were you actually talking about supermarkets, or were you talking about cash loan shops?
My understanding was that it was the supermarkets who, of course, have got records of their customers, like the Tesco's and Sainsbury's have here, who decided to get into extending credit to their customers because they had a record. It's the argument that if you've got a savings record in a bank of taxi drivers, you can lend money to taxi drivers. You don't have to know their income. It can be unstable. And the South African banks were lending on this basis and doing very good business out of it, and lending an awful lot of money. But I have no detail, but this is what I was told in South Africa.
No, I mean, I think it's not so much the supermarkets doing. I mean, what's happening is that happens in South Africa is you do have credit bureaus, so that people who are active credit borrowers at least get recorded. So people like banks can then lend on the basis of a credit record, and only the issue there has been around whether people got loans that shouldn't have had loans, and then got their credit records got blacklisted. And they were unfairly blacklisted because they were unfairly lent to, because it was a sort of quasi subprime situation that they were missold in the first place, and that has been a bit of an issue. But I think it raises so it's not so I thought you were talking about different channels of lending, but now I think I understand what your what the question is that you're asking about. But I think there is an important issue about credit bureaus and the absence thereof that causes disarray, frankly, in a lot of these markets. So there just isn't enough information to allow lenders to be able to determine whether somebody is likely to be over-indebted or not. And I think this raises an interesting point about regulation, because the explosion in commercial microlending in South Africa led ultimately to a new credit act, which basically did away with a lot of this kind of reckless lending that was going on, and interest rates have come down, and the market they're still quite high, but the market is more normalized. And in many of these markets, certainly in Africa, is that there just simply is no regulation for this kind of credit, just none. So it's not surprising that when organizations like the South African microlenders go and export the sort of payroll lending model, it takes off like wildfire, and we do have a problem of over-indebtedness, and that's that. But I think the problem of over-indebtedness is not restricted to payroll lenders. I think the what you might call the sort of the more NGO type microfinance institutions are contributing to that as well. There's no question about it. I think it raises the whole need for proper consumer protection, and I think that's part of the evolution of this market, is that it does need now to be assessed and properly regulated in a way that I don't think it was before. And I think that's the point that Malcolm's raising. It's a business now, and it needs to be sort of monitored and regulated. You can't put it back in its box. And I think what I would say there is that it's also likely to become much more competitive for the microfinance industry as well. You're seeing, I've been doing a lot of work in Rwanda recently, where actually in that market, you're finding banks competing really head-on with microfinance institutions, which kind of says that maybe the microfinance institutions aren't doing the job that their well-meaning funders meant them to do, but they are basically head-to-head with the banks and with some of the cooperatives and so on and so forth. But actually in that market there is an increasing amount of competition around the supply of small amounts of finance to really quite poor people. And I'm talking about people who are earning less than $20 a month. There is competition in that market, which is the point I'm making, is that we shouldn't be necessarily just focused on whether microfinance is a bad thing or not. We should be looking at creating that diversity of supply, because that's when you get the competition. And that to me is exciting, because it does mean that consumers then start to get a proper voice. Just the final point on this question of the lobby. I think, again, I do agree with Milford. I think there probably has been a diversion of resources away from this notion of financial inclusion, a more broad-based idea about who should be playing in financial markets, and I think it has been captured to a certain extent by microfinance. So when I started doing my work in Southern Africa, always you'd go to a country and it would be, oh no, we can't talk to you then because we're busy talking about introducing microfinance regulations. And the microfinance regulations would be all about sort of microfinance institutions, but it kind of left out the whole issue of cooperatives and banks and mobile payments and all the rest of it. And you really do need to have a much broader conversation around those sorts of issues too.
Okay. Unfortunately, I think that's all we've got time for. I know there were some other questions, but I think the speakers will all be around for a little while after this session if you want to raise any further issues. There will be refreshments outside as well, some wine, so please do join us for that. Books can also be purchased outside. As I said, the note of the meeting will be on the website in the next few days, as will the recording of the meeting. Just to say that ODI does have a wider work stream on access to finance and financial sector development more generally, which looks at some of the other issues that Mark was talking about, the role of banks and cooperatives, etc., in providing access to finance and how the poor use those financial services. And there will be some publications coming out in the near future, so if you're interested, do please check out our website. Little plug. And so thank you again for coming, and please join me in thanking all three speakers for a really stimulating discussion.